They told me I wasn't welcome at my own grandfather's funeral, said there wasn't enough space, that it was for immediate family only. But when I drove past Riverside Memorial Chapel that morning, I counted 47 empty parking spaces and saw through the window a guest book with my name deliberately scratched out in thick black ink. My Aunt Jessica stood there in her expensive coat, looked me straight in the eye through the glass doors, and mouthed the words that would haunt her forever. "You don't belong here." What she didn't know was that in exactly 3 hours, I would activate a single clause that would strip her and the rest of my family of their $3 million inheritance. What she really didn't know was that I wasn't just the family outcast they'd spent years trying to erase. I was an estate planning attorney who'd helped my grandfather craft the most ironclad will Oregon had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I need you to understand something about being the black sheep of a wealthy family. It's not just about being different or disappointing expectations. It's about being systematically erased from every meaningful moment until you start to believe maybe you really don't matter. For 28 years, I'd been the family afterthought, the one they talked about in hushed tones at Christmas dinner, the daughter who never quite lived up to her potential. What they never bothered to discover was that I'd not only lived up to my potential, I'd exceeded it in ways they couldn't even comprehend. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday in my downtown Portland apartment. I was reviewing case files for my estate planning practice, sipping coffee from the mug my grandfather had given me for my law school graduation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I specialized in the very area of law that would soon turn my family's world upside down. My phone buzzed with a text message, and without thinking, I glanced at the screen. It was from my cousin Amy, and it was a photo that made my coffee go cold in my hands. The image showed my entire extended family gathered on the steps of Riverside Memorial Chapel, all dressed in their finest black attire for what was clearly a funeral service. My Uncle Robert stood at the center, his arm around my Aunt Jessica, both of them looking appropriately somber. My cousins Mark and David were there with their wives. Even 8-year-old Emma clutched a small bouquet of white roses. Everyone looked like they belonged, like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The caption underneath made my stomach clench, saying goodbye to Grandpa Joe. He would have loved seeing the whole family together. Amy had tagged me in the photo by mistake. I set my phone down and walked to my window, looking out at the gray Portland morning. The rain was starting, typical for March, and I watched the droplets race down the glass while my mind processed what I'd just seen. I hadn't been told about any funeral. I hadn't received a call about Grandpa Joe passing away. I hadn't been informed about arrangements, about services, about anything. I opened my phone again and scrolled through my messages, my call log, my email. Nothing. Not a single communication from any family member about the death of the man who had raised me when my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Just 2 weeks ago, I'd been at my Aunt Jessica's house for what I thought was a regular family dinner. I'd excused myself to use the bathroom, and on my way back, I'd heard voices from the kitchen. Jessica's voice, sharp and decisive. "When the time comes, we're not telling Sarah about the service. She'll just show up and make it all about her drama like she always does. Dad's funeral should be dignified, not a circus." My Uncle Robert's voice had been quieter, uncertain. Maybe we should include her. She was close to him. Jessica's response had been swift and brutal. Close to him? Please, she only visited when she needed money for law school. Now that she's got her fancy degree, she acts like she's too good for this family. Let her find out after the fact. It's better for everyone. I'd stood in that hallway, my hand on the bathroom door, feeling like I'd been slapped. But I'd convinced myself I'd misunderstood, that Jessica was just stressed. that surely they wouldn't actually exclude me from something so important. I'd been wrong. They hadn't misunderstood anything. They'd made a calculated decision to erase me from the most significant goodbye of my life. The grief hit me then, not just for losing Grandpa Joe, but for losing the illusion that somewhere, deep down, my family actually cared about me. I should have been crying. I should have been calling them, demanding to know why they'd done this, begging to be included even at the last minute. Instead, something else rose up in me. Something colder and more purposeful than tears. I walked to my home office and pulled out a file I hadn't looked at in months. The tab read, Mitchell Family. Trust, confidential. 18 months ago, Grandpa Joe had called me with an unusual request. He wanted to update his will, and he wanted me to handle it personally. "Sarah," he'd said, his voice careful and measured, "I've been watching this family for a long time. I've seen how they treat you, and I've seen who you've become despite that treatment. I want to make sure my legacy goes to someone who deserves it." I'd tried to protest, to tell him that family was complicated, that maybe he was being too harsh. He'd stopped me with a look I'd never forget. "Sweetheart, when people show you who they are, believe them. I've been believing what this family shows me for years. Now I want to do something about it." The will we'd crafted together was a masterpiece of legal precision. Grandpa Joe hadn't just wanted to leave me his estate. He'd wanted to ensure that the family members who'd spent years diminishing me would face consequences for their behavior. The document contained a clause I'd initially argued against, thinking it was too harsh. Now, sitting in my apartment on the morning of his funeral, I realized he'd been a prophet. I got dressed methodically, choosing a simple black suit and modest heels. I wasn't going to the funeral. I was going to change the trajectory of my family's life forever. The drive to downtown Portland took 25 minutes, and I spent every one of them thinking about the conversation I'd had with Mr. Harrison, Grandpa Joe's longtime attorney, just 3 days after he'd passed away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The man had called me directly, his voice professional but warm. "Sarah, I'm sorry for your loss. Your grandfather spoke of you often, and always with tremendous pride. I need you to know that he passed peacefully and that his affairs are completely in order. I'll be handling the will reading, of course, but I wanted you to be aware that there are some unique provisions that may come into play depending on how the family behaves in the coming days." The law offices of Harrison and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming building in downtown Portland. I'd been there several times over the past year and a half, working with Mr. Harrison to ensure every detail of Grandpa Joe's estate plan was legally bulletproof. The receptionist, Mrs. Chen, looked up as I walked in and immediately rose from her desk. "Ms. Mitchell," she said quietly, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Harrison is expecting you." Before she could say anything else, the elevator doors opened, and my Aunt Jessica stepped out, followed by my Uncle Robert. Jessica was dressed impeccably as always, her black designer coat probably costing more than most people's monthly rent. Her makeup was perfect despite supposedly being in mourning, and her jewelry was subtle but expensive. She stopped short when she saw me, her eyes narrowing with the kind of irritation you'd show an uninvited guest. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that managed to sound concerned while making it clear you were an inconvenience. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably behind her, adjusting his tie and avoiding my eyes. He'd always been the weaker of the two, going along with Jessica's decisions to keep the peace. "The funeral was this morning," he said quietly, as if I might have been confused about the timing. "We figured you were probably busy with work." I looked at both of them calmly, my hands folded in front of me. "I'm here about the will," I said simply. Jessica's perfectly penciled eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. The will? Honey, that's being handled by the adults. You don't need to concern yourself with Dad's business affairs. The condescension in her voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She'd been talking to me like this for years, as if I were still the confused 12-year-old who'd needed her guidance. After my parents died, what she didn't realize was that the confused little girl had grown up to become someone who could dismantle her entire world with the stroke of a pen. I turned to Mrs. Chen, ignoring Jessica's dismissive comment completely. Could you please let Mr. Harrison know that Sarah Mitchell is here for the Mitchell estate matter? He'll want to see me immediately. The way I said it, with quiet authority and complete confidence, seemed to register with the receptionist in a way that made Jessica's frown deepen. Mrs. Chen nodded and picked up her phone, speaking in low tones to someone on the other end. Oh, please, Jessica laughed, but there was an edge to it now. Mr. Harrison doesn't take walk-ins, especially not today when we have important family business to discuss. Sarah, maybe you should go home and let us handle this properly. She was still trying to dismiss me, still trying to put me back in the box she'd constructed for me over the years. What she didn't understand was that I'd already broken out of that box and built something she couldn't even comprehend. The inner office door opened, and Mr. Harrison stepped out. He was exactly as I remembered him, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect in any room. But what happened next was something Jessica clearly hadn't expected. His entire face lit up when he saw me, and he walked directly past my aunt and uncle to extend his hand. Sarah, he said warmly, and I could hear the genuine affection in his voice. I'm so glad you came in today. We have quite a bit to discuss. The silence that followed was profound. I watched Jessica's mouth fall open slightly, watched Uncle Robert's eyebrows furrow in confusion as they tried to process what they were seeing. Mr. Harrison, the man they'd clearly expected to handle them with deference and attention, had just prioritized me over both of them. He gestured toward his office with a slight smile. Please come in. I believe we can get everything sorted out quite quickly. Then he turned to Jessica and Robert with polite but distant professionalism. I'll be with you both shortly. This shouldn't take very long. As I walked past them toward Mr. Harrison's office, I heard Jessica's sharp intake of breath behind me. How do you even know him? She demanded, her voice rising slightly above the professional whisper appropriate for a law office. I turned back to face them, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely comfortable letting my family see exactly who I'd become. Mr. Harrison has been my colleague and mentor since I graduated from law school, I said evenly. He helped me establish my practice here in Portland. The words hung in the air like smoke. Uncle Robert blinked rapidly, as if trying to process information that didn't fit with his understanding of reality. Your practice? Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper, and I could see her mind racing to reconcile this new information with the narrative she'd constructed about my life. For years, she'd told anyone who would listen that I was struggling, that I was still trying to find myself, that I was the family member who'd never quite managed to get her life together. The fact that I'd not only gotten my life together, but had built something successful was clearly something she'd never considered. Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly. Sarah specializes in estate planning and probate law. She's developed quite a reputation in the field. Your grandfather was tremendously proud of her accomplishments. I watched my aunt's face go pale as the implications of what she was hearing began to sink in. I wasn't just the family failure they'd written off. I was a successful attorney who specialized in exactly the area of law that governed what was about to happen to them. We moved into Mr. Harrison's office, a beautifully appointed room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Portland skyline. He gestured for me to take a seat at his conference table while Jessica and Robert remained standing, clearly uncertain about what was happening or what their role was supposed to be. Mr. Harrison opened his leather portfolio and withdrew a thick, document that I recognized immediately. It was Grandpa Joe's will, the document we'd spent months perfecting together. "Sarah," Mr. Harrison said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for official business. "As we discussed when your grandfather updated his will last year, you are named as the primary beneficiary of his estate." The words were simple, straightforward, but they landed like bombs in the quiet office. Jessica actually laughed out loud, a sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed off the windows. "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "Dad would never leave everything to her. She's barely family." Mr. Harrison continued as if she hadn't spoken. "The estate is valued at just over $3 million, consisting of real estate holdings in Oregon and California, a diversified investment portfolio, and controlling interest in several business ventures." Uncle Robert had gone completely silent, his face taking on an ashen quality that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. I looked directly at Jessica, watching her try to process information that was completely outside her understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "Grandpa Joe changed his will 18 months ago," I said quietly. "Right after the family Christmas dinner where you announced to everyone that I was an embarrassment who would never contribute anything meaningful to the family legacy." I watched her eyes widen as the memory hit her. That dinner had been particularly brutal, with Jessica holding court about my various failures and shortcomings while the rest of the family nodded along or stayed strategically silent. What she hadn't known was that Grandpa Joe had called me the very next day to discuss updating his estate plan. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my own folder, filled with copies of documents I'd requested months ago when Grandpa Joe first told me about the changes he was making. "This is particularly interesting," I said, spreading papers across the conference table. "The family business that Uncle Robert has been managing for the past 5 years, the one that's been generating substantial profits and paying executive salaries?" I pointed to the incorporation papers, watching Robert's face go red as he realized what I was showing them. "It was initially funded with money from a trust fund that Grandpa Joe established for me when I was born." The silence in the room was deafening. Robert opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Jessica was frantically digging through her purse, her hands shaking slightly as she searched for something. I continued calmly. "According to these financial statements, the business has generated over $800,000 in profit over the past 3 years, profit that was supposed to be reinvested or distributed to the actual beneficiary of the trust that funded it." I looked up at Robert, who was now sweating despite the air conditioning. "Instead, you and Jessica have been paying yourselves substantial salaries while telling everyone I was the family charity case who couldn't manage her own finances." Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "There's something else you both need to understand," he said, activating the large screen mounted on the conference room wall. Financial documents filled the display, showing the full scope of Grandpa Joe's estate in detail: real estate holdings, investment accounts, business valuations, everything laid out in precise legal formatting. Your father included a very specific clause in his will, one that he insisted on despite my initial reservations about its enforceability. The next screen showed a section of legal text that I had memorized word for word. Jessica leaned forward, squinting at the display as she tried to read the dense legal language. Mr. Harrison read it aloud. "In the event that any family member deliberately excludes Sarah Mitchell from major family events, including but not limited to weddings, funerals, or significant celebrations, without documented just cause, their inheritance rights under this will are immediately and irrevocably forfeited, with their portion of the estate reverting to Sarah Mitchell." The color drained from Jessica's face completely. "He couldn't have known about today," she whispered. But even as she said it, I could see in her eyes that she understood exactly what had happened. Uncle Robert was staring at the screen as if the words might change if he looked at them hard. "Enough." I spoke quietly, my voice steady and clear. Actually, he predicted it. When we were drafting this clause, he told me, "Sarah, I guarantee you that when I die, Jessica will try to exclude you from my funeral. She won't be able to help herself. It's who she is." I thought he was being too harsh, but he insisted we include this provision anyway. I paused, letting the implications sink in. "Your deliberate exclusion of me from this morning's funeral service has triggered the forfeiture clause. According to the legal language you just heard, you've both just lost your inheritance rights." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, Jessica found her voice. "This can't be legal. You can't just... People can't lose inheritances because of family disagreements." But even as she said, I could see the doubt in her eyes. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't a family disagreement. This was a carefully planned legal consequence for behavior that had been going on for years. Mr. Harrison spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent decades practicing law. "The clause is completely enforceable under Oregon state law. Your father was of sound mind when he created this will. He had competent legal counsel, and the language is unambiguous." Ms. Mitchell's exclusion from this morning's funeral service, combined with the documentation we have of the deliberate nature of that exclusion, constitutes a clear trigger of the forfeiture provision. I stood up slowly, gathering my documents with the same methodical precision I'd used to get dressed that morning. Everything about this moment felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. For years, I'd been the one who was excluded, dismissed, treated like an inconvenience. Now, in the space of 30 minutes, the entire power dynamic of my family had shifted completely. "Mr. Harrison will handle all the paperwork for the asset transfers and the forfeiture documentation," I said, looking at both Jessica and Robert. "I'm sure you'll want to have your own attorneys review everything, though I should mention that Grandpa Joe specifically chose language that's been upheld in similar cases across multiple jurisdictions." Jessica was still staring at the screen, as if she could will the words to change. Uncle Robert finally spoke, his voice hoarse with shock. "Sarah, we can work this out. Family doesn't take each other to court over money." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Family also didn't exclude each other from funerals, but that hadn't stopped them from doing exactly that just hours earlier. I looked at him with something that might have been pity if I'd had any energy left for emotional responses. "You're absolutely right, Uncle Robert. Family doesn't fight over money. Family also doesn't deliberately exclude someone from saying goodbye to the person who raised them." I walked toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. "The funeral is over now, but you're welcome to visit Grandpa Joe's grave whenever you'd like. Just don't expect me to pretend we're family when you do." 6 months later, I'm sitting in the sunroom of what used to be Grandpa Joe's house and is now legally mine, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees he planted when I was a child. The legal proceedings are complete. The $3 million estate has been properly transferred. The family business is under new management, and I've implemented profit sharing for the employees who actually do the work rather than just collecting executive salaries. But the most valuable thing I inherited wasn't the money or the property. It was the validation that someone had seen my worth when I couldn't see it myself, and had taken steps to ensure that worth was recognized even after he was gone. I've established a legal aid clinic that helps families navigate estate disputes, because I learned that the most powerful thing you can do with unexpected fortune isn't to punish people for underestimating you. It's to use that fortune to help others who've been underestimated too. The interesting thing about justice is that it doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like a quiet Tuesday morning when you realize that the people who tried to erase you no longer have the power to do so. Sometimes it looks like discovering that the person you thought you'd lost had actually given you everything you needed to build a life where no one could ever exclude you again. Have you ever been systematically excluded by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? What would you do if you suddenly found yourself holding the power to change everything? Let me know in the comments below, because tomorrow I have another story that will show you exactly what happens when the underestimated rise up and reclaim their power. The thing about discovering you've been systematically excluded from the most important day of your life is that it clarifies everything else with brutal precision. Standing in my apartment that morning, looking at that photo of my family gathered without me, I felt something shift inside my chest. It wasn't the hot rush of anger or the crushing weight of heartbreak that you might expect. It was something colder, more purposeful. It was the moment I stopped making excuses for people who had never made excuses for me. I walked to my closet and began getting dressed with deliberate care. Black wool blazer, the one I'd bought for court appearances when I needed to project. Authority without arrogance. Charcoal gray slacks that fit perfectly, conveying professionalism without drawing attention. Low black heels that I could walk confidently in for hours if necessary. I wasn't dressing for a funeral anymore. I was dressing for war, the kind of war that's fought in conference rooms with documents and legal precedents instead of raised voices and slammed doors. As I buttoned my blazer, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. For years, I'd seen myself through my family's eyes. The disappointment, the one who never quite measured up, the charity case they tolerated out of obligation. But the woman in the mirror was someone else entirely. She was composed, professional, successful. She was someone who had built a life that mattered, even if her family had never bothered to notice. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Mr. Harrison answered on the second ring, his voice warm but professional. "Sarah, I was hoping I'd hear from you today. I assume you've seen the family's activities this morning?" The way he said it told me everything I needed to know. He'd been expecting this call, had probably been waiting for it since the moment Grandpa Joe's body was found 3 days ago. "They excluded me from the funeral," I said simply, settling into the chair by my window. "Deliberately. I have photographic evidence of the family gathering, and I never received any notification about the service arrangements." My voice was steady, clinical, the way I'd learned to speak when presenting evidence in court. Mr. Harrison was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him shuffling papers on the other end of the line. "I see," he said finally. "And you're certain this was intentional exclusion rather than an oversight?" I almost laughed at the question, but there was nothing humorous about any of this. "Mr. Harrison, my name was crossed out on the guest list. My cousin accidentally sent me a photo of the entire family at the service, and I have a text message from 2 weeks ago where my aunt explicitly stated that I shouldn't be informed about the arrangements." I paused, letting that sink in. This wasn't an oversight. This was a calculated decision. There was another pause, longer this time. When Mr. Harrison spoke again, his voice had taken on the formal tone I'd heard him use during the most serious legal proceedings. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Your grandfather included that forfeiture clause specifically because he anticipated this exact scenario. He told me, and I quote, 'Jessica will try to exclude Sarah from my funeral because she can't bear the thought of sharing attention, even in grief.' I thought he was being overly harsh at the time, but he insisted the language stay in the will." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of something that might have been gratitude if it hadn't been so mixed with grief. Even in death, Grandpa Joe had been protecting me from the family that had spent years trying to diminish me. "What do I need to do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'd helped draft the language myself, had argued against it initially because I thought it was too punitive. Now I understood that it wasn't punishment at all. It was justice. "Bring me any documentation you have of the exclusion," Mr. Harrison said. "The photo, the text messages, anything that demonstrates the deliberate nature of their actions. I'll need to see the original will provisions as well, though I assume you have copies. I did have copies. I had detailed files on every aspect of Grandpa Joe's estate plan, because that's what good attorneys do. They keep meticulous records. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the quiet of my apartment for several minutes, processing what was about to happen. In less than 2 hours, I would walk into Mr. Harrison's office and trigger a legal provision that would fundamentally alter my family's financial future. Jessica and Robert would lose their inheritance rights completely. The $3 million estate that they'd been counting on, planning around, probably already spending in their minds, would become mine in its entirety. The thought should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like the closing of a door that had been slowly swinging shut for years. This wasn't really about money, though the money was significant. This was about the final acknowledgement that the family I'd spent my entire adult life trying to belong to had never wanted me to belong at all. They hadn't just excluded me from a funeral. They'd excluded me from the fundamental human experience of grieving with people who supposedly loved you. I walked to my home office and pulled out the file cabinet where I kept all my personal legal documents. The Mitchell Family Trust folder was thick, filled with months of correspondence, draft documents, and financial statements. I'd been meticulous about documentation because that's what the law requires, but also because some part of me had always known this day might come. Grandpa Joe had been equally thorough, insisting on language that would stand up to any legal challenge and provisions that covered every possible scenario. As I gathered the documents I would need, I found myself thinking about the conversation that had started all of this. It had been a Saturday afternoon in early fall, almost 2 years ago now. I'd driven down to visit Grandpa Joe at his house, the same house where I'd spent so many weekends as a child after my parents died. He'd made coffee and we'd sat in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd taught me to make pancakes and helped me with homework, and listened to me cry about boys who didn't call back. "Sarah," he'd said that day, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." I'd nodded, curious about the serious tone in his voice. How does this family treat you? Really treat you, not how they pretend to treat you in front of me. The question had caught me off guard because nobody had ever asked me that before. Nobody had ever acknowledged that there might be a difference between how my family treated me publicly and how they treated me privately. I'd tried to deflect at first, to give him the standard answers about family being complicated and everyone having their differences. But he'd pressed me, gently but persistently, until I'd finally told him the truth about being excluded from family events, about being talked about behind my back, about being treated like an obligation rather than a choice, about Jessica's constant criticism and Robert's passive complicity, about feeling like I was always auditioning for acceptance in a family that had already decided I didn't deserve it. Grandpa Joe had listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with every revelation. When I finished talking, he'd been quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the garden he'd tended for 40 years. Finally, he'd spoken, and his words had stayed with me ever since. "Sarah, I failed you. I knew what was happening, and I didn't stop it because I kept hoping they'd come around on their own. But people don't come around on their own. They come around when there are consequences for their behavior." That conversation had led to months of meetings with Mr. Harrison, careful planning sessions where we'd crafted a will that would serve as both protection and consequence. Grandpa Joe had been methodical about it, thinking through every possible scenario and every potential legal challenge. He'd insisted on language that was clear and unambiguous, provisions that couldn't be misinterpreted or argued away in court. Most importantly, he'd insisted on the forfeiture clause, the provision that would strip inheritance rights from anyone who deliberately excluded me from major family events. "They'll test it," he'd told me during one of our planning sessions, "probably at my funeral, because Jessica won't be able to resist having complete control over the narrative." She'll convince herself that excluding you is for the good of the family, that it's what I would have wanted. But what I actually want is for there to be consequences when people treat you like you don't matter. Now, 18 months later, his prediction had come true with devastating accuracy. Jessica had indeed tried to exclude me from his funeral, had indeed convinced herself that it was the right thing to do. What she hadn't counted on was that her actions would trigger legal consequences that would reshape our family's financial landscape forever. She'd been so focused on controlling the immediate situation that she'd failed to consider the long-term implications of her choices. I finished gathering the documents I would need and placed them in my briefcase with the same care I'd use for any important legal proceeding. Bank statements showing the trust fund that had been established for me as a child. Corporate documents revealing that the family business had been funded with my money. Financial records demonstrating years of profit that should have been distributed to me as the beneficiary. And most importantly, the text messages and photos that proved today's exclusion had been deliberate and calculated. The drive to Mr. Harrison's office would take about 25 minutes in morning traffic, and I used that time to prepare myself mentally for what was about to happen. This wasn't just about activating a legal clause or claiming an inheritance. This was about fundamentally changing the power dynamic in a family that had spent years treating me like a second-class member. For the first time in my adult life, I would be in a position of strength rather than constantly defending my right to exist in their orbit. I thought about Jessica's face when she realized what was happening, about the moment she would understand that her attempts to exclude me had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. I thought about Robert's reaction when he learned that the business he'd been managing for years wasn't actually his to manage. I thought about the rest of my extended family, the cousins and aunts and uncles who had stood by and watched while I was systematically marginalized, and how they would react when they learned that their silence had enabled this outcome. But mostly, I thought about Grandpa Joe and the conversation we'd had about consequences. He'd understood something that I was only beginning to grasp. That love without boundaries isn't actually love at all. It's enabling. It's permission for people to treat you poorly because they know there will never be any real repercussions for their behavior. By crafting this will, by insisting on consequences for deliberate exclusion, he'd given me something more valuable than money. He'd given me the power to enforce my own worth. The downtown Portland skyline came into view as I navigated the morning traffic, and I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This wasn't about revenge, though I knew my family would probably see it that way. This was about justice, about the universe finally acknowledging that actions have consequences and that people who systematically hurt others should face real repercussions for their choices. Jessica and Robert had spent years assuming that their behavior toward me existed in a vacuum, that they could exclude and dismiss me without any cost to themselves. Today, they were going to learn otherwise. I parked in the underground garage of Mr. Harrison's building and took the elevator to the 15th floor, my briefcase in one hand and my phone in the other. The photo Amy had accidentally sent me was still on my screen, and I stared at it one more time before putting the phone away. There they all were, my entire family, gathered together to say goodbye to the man who had loved us all. Except they hadn't loved us all equally, and now that inequality was going to cost them everything they thought they were entitled to. The receptionist at Harrison and Associates looked up as I entered, her expression immediately shifting to one of professional sympathy. "Ms. Mitchell," she said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Harrison is expecting you." I thanked her and was about to ask her to let Mr. Harrison know I'd arrived when the elevator doors opened behind me. Jessica stepped out first, dressed in an expensive black coat that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Her makeup was perfect despite the early hour, her jewelry understated but clearly expensive. She looked every inch the grieving daughter, except for the flash of irritation that crossed her face when she saw me standing there. Behind her, Robert emerged from the elevator, adjusting his tie and looking uncomfortable in the way he always did when he found himself in situations that required him to take a position on anything. Sarah? Jessica's voice carried that particular tone of surprise mixed with annoyance that I'd heard so many times over the years. What are you doing here? She looked me up and down, taking in my professional attire and briefcase, clearly trying to figure out why I was in a law office on the morning of our grandfather's funeral. Shouldn't you be? She started to say, then seemed to remember that I wasn't supposed to know about the funeral in the first place. I looked at her calmly, my hands folded in front of me in the posture I'd perfected during years of courtroom appearances. I'm here about the will, I said simply, my voice steady and professional. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow, and I watched her eyebrows shoot up toward her hairline as she processed what I'd said. The will? She repeated, as if the concept was foreign to her. Honey, that's family business. You don't need to worry about legal matters. The condescension in her voice was so thick it was almost tangible. The same dismissive tone she'd been using with me for years. She still saw me as the confused child who needed guidance and protection from the complexities of adult responsibilities. What she didn't realize was that the confused child had grown up to become someone who understood legal complexities better than she ever would. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't there as a confused family member seeking guidance. I was there as an attorney who had helped craft one of the most ironclad estate plans Oregon had ever seen, and I was about to activate provisions that would change her life forever. I turned to the receptionist, deliberately ignoring Jessica's attempt to dismiss me. Could you please let Mr. Harrison know that Sarah Mitchell is here regarding the Mitchell estate matter? He's expecting me. The authority in my voice seemed to surprise the receptionist, who immediately picked up her phone to make the call. I could feel Jessica's eyes on me, could sense her confusion as she tried to reconcile the person I was presenting myself to, be with the person she thought I was. Oh, please, Jessica said, but there was less confidence in her voice now. Mr. Harrison doesn't take walk-ins, especially not today when we have important family matters to discuss. She was still trying to maintain control of the situation, still trying to put me back in the subordinate position she'd constructed for me over the years. But I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice, could see the way her eyes kept darting between me and the receptionist as she tried to understand what was happening. The inner office door opened, and Mr. Harrison stepped out. He was exactly as I remembered him from our previous meetings, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. But what happened next was clearly not what Jessica had expected. His entire face lit up when he saw me, and he walked directly toward me, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Sarah," he said, and I could hear the affection in his voice. "I'm so glad you could make it in today. We have quite a lot to discuss." He gestured toward his office with a slight smile, then turned to Jessica and Robert with polite but distant professionalism. "I'll be with you both in just a few minutes. This shouldn't take very long." The silence that followed was profound and telling. I watched Jessica's mouth fall open slightly as she processed what she'd just witnessed. Mr. Harrison, the man she'd clearly expected to handle with the deference due to grieving family members, had just prioritized me over both of them. He'd treated me not as a confused young woman who needed guidance, but as someone whose time and presence were valuable and important. "How do you even know him?" Jessica demanded, her voice rising slightly above the hushed tones appropriate for a law office. The question came out sharper than she'd intended, revealing the depth of her confusion and growing alarm. This wasn't fitting the narrative she'd constructed about my life, wasn't matching the story she'd been telling herself and others about my failures and inadequacies. I turned to face them both, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely comfortable letting my family see exactly who I had become. "Mr. Harrison has been my colleague and mentor since I graduated from law school," I said evenly, my voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. He helped me establish my practice here in Portland." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I watched Uncle Robert blink rapidly, his face cycling through confusion, surprise, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Jessica just stared at me, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the shock in her eyes. For years, she'd been telling anyone who would listen that I was struggling, that I was still trying to find my direction, that I was the family member who couldn't quite get her act together. The revelation that I not only had my act together, but had built something successful and professional, was clearly outside the realm of her imagination. She'd been so invested in the narrative of my inadequacy that she'd never bothered to check whether that narrative matched reality. She'd assumed that because she didn't value my accomplishments, they didn't exist. Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly, his expression warm with professional pride. "Sarah specializes in estate planning and probate law. She's developed quite a reputation in her field over the past few years. Your grandfather spoke of her accomplishments often, and always with tremendous pride." I watched Jessica's face go pale as the implications of what she was hearing began to penetrate. I wasn't just the family failure she'd written off. I was a successful attorney who specialized in exactly the area of law that would govern what was about to happen to all of them. As we moved toward Mr. Harrison's office, I could feel the shift in power dynamics that had been building for months, finally crystallizing into something tangible. Jessica and Robert followed behind us, no longer leading the conversation or controlling the agenda. They were about to discover that the person they'd spent years dismissing and excluding had not only survived their neglect, but had thrived in spite of it. The conference room where we settled was beautifully appointed, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Portland skyline, and a mahogany table that could seat 12 people comfortably. Mr. Harrison gestured for me to take a seat at the head of the table, a subtle but significant positioning that placed me in the power position for what was about to unfold. Jessica and Robert took seats across from me, their body language still suggesting they expected to be the primary focus of this meeting. Mr. Harrison opened his leather portfolio and withdrew the thick document that would change everything. I recognized it immediately as Grandpa Joe's will, the document we'd spent months perfecting together. Every clause had been carefully crafted, every provision thoroughly researched and legally vetted. Most importantly, the forfeiture clause that was about to be triggered had been written with precisely this scenario in mind. "Before we begin," Mr. Harrison said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for the most serious legal proceedings, "I need to make sure everyone understands the gravity of what we're discussing today. This isn't simply a matter of reading a will and distributing assets. There are specific provisions in this document that may fundamentally alter how this estate is distributed, depending on certain actions that may or may not have taken place." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the table surface. "What kind of provisions?" she asked, though something in her voice suggested she was beginning to suspect this meeting wasn't going to unfold the way she'd expected. Robert remained silent, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. Mr. Harrison looked directly at me, and I nodded slightly, giving him permission to proceed. This was the moment we'd been preparing for, the culmination of months of careful planning and legal preparation. "Your father included a very specific forfeiture clause in his will," Mr. Harrison said, his words measured and precise. "It states that if any family member deliberately excludes Sarah Mitchell from major family events, including funerals, without documented just cause, their inheritance rights are immediately and irrevocably revoked." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the color drain from Jessica's face as the words sank in. Robert's mouth opened slightly, then closed again without sound. They were both beginning to understand that this wasn't just a family meeting about inheritance distribution. This was a legal proceeding that would determine whether they had any inheritance rights left at all. "Now," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice professionally neutral, "I need to ask a very important question. and I need complete honesty in your response. Was Sarah Mitchell informed about the funeral arrangements for her grandfather? Was she invited to attend the service that took place this morning? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Jessica's eyes darted between Mr. Harrison and me, and I could see her mind racing to find a way to answer that wouldn't incriminate her. But there was no safe answer, because the truth was damning, and a lie would be easily disproven. Robert looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, his face pale and drawn. This was the moment when everything I'd built toward over the past months would finally come to fruition. The documentation I'd gathered, the evidence I'd compiled, the legal provisions Grandpa Joe and I had crafted together, all of it was about to serve its intended purpose. Justice was about to be served, not with dramatic flourishes or emotional outbursts, but with the quiet, inexorable power of carefully applied law. The reckoning had begun, and there was no going back for any of us. Jessica's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds. I watched her face cycle through a dozen different expressions as she searched for an answer that wouldn't destroy her. The truth was that she had deliberately excluded me from the funeral, had actively worked to ensure I wouldn't know about the arrangements. But admitting that truth would trigger the very legal consequences she was only now beginning to understand existed. Finally, she cleared her throat and attempted what might have been the worst lie of her life. "Of course Sarah was invited," she said, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal. We sent her all the information. Maybe it got lost in the mail, or maybe she was too busy with her work to pay attention. She gestured vaguely in my direction, as if my presence in the room was evidence of some kind of miscommunication rather than a deliberate act of exclusion. Mr. Harrison looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly giving me the opportunity to respond. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew my phone, placing it on the conference table with deliberate precision. "I have a text message from my cousin Amy, sent at 9:37 this morning," I said calmly. "It's a photograph of the entire family gathered at Riverside Memorial Chapel for the funeral service. Amy tagged me in the photo by accident, which is how I learned that the service was taking place." Jessica's face went even paler, but she tried to maintain her composure. "That doesn't prove anything," she said quickly. "Maybe Amy didn't realize you were supposed to be there. Maybe there was confusion about the arrangements." But her voice lacked conviction, and I could see the desperation creeping into her eyes as she realized how weak her position was becoming. I tapped the screen of my phone and pulled up my message history. "I also have text messages from 2 weeks ago," I continued, my voice steady and professional. "Messages where you explicitly stated that I should not be informed about the funeral arrangements because I would make it all about myself and turn the service into what you called a circus." I turned the phone so that Mr. Harrison could see the screen, watching as he read the damning words that Jessica had sent to other family members. The silence in the room was profound. Robert had gone completely still, staring at his hands as if they might provide some escape from the situation unfolding around him. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, clearly realizing that anything she said at this point would only make things worse. The evidence was overwhelming, and no amount of creative storytelling could explain away the clear proof of deliberate exclusion. Mr. Harrison made notes on his legal pad, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite the explosive nature of what he was documenting. "Sarah, do you have any other evidence of this deliberate exclusion? Any other communications or documentation that would support your claim that this was intentional rather than accidental?" I reached back into my briefcase and withdrew a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. "I have screenshots of the guest list that was posted on the funeral home's website," I said, opening the folder to reveal printed pages. "My name appears on the original list, but it's been crossed out with a black marker. I also have emails between family members discussing the need to keep the funeral small and manageable by excluding what they called problematic family members." Each piece of evidence I presented felt like another nail in the coffin of Jessica's inheritance prospects. She was clearly struggling to comprehend how thoroughly I'd documented her actions, how carefully I'd preserved every piece of proof that would be needed to trigger the forfeiture clause. What she didn't understand was that this level of documentation was second nature to me as an attorney. I'd been building a legal case without even realizing it. "There's more," I continued, withdrawing another set of documents from my folder. "I have a recorded voicemail from my Uncle Robert, left on my phone 3 days ago, where he explicitly states that the family has decided it would be better for everyone if I didn't attend the funeral. He mentions that this decision was made to avoid any unpleasant scenes that might detract from the dignity of the service." Robert's head snapped up at the mention of his voicemail, his face going red with embarrassment and what might have been fear. That was taken out of context," he stammered. "I was just trying to explain the family's concerns about keeping things peaceful. It wasn't meant to be exclusionary." But his protest sounded weak even to his own ears, and I could see him sinking further into his chair as the weight of his own words came back to haunt him. Jessica finally found her voice again, though it came out strained and desperate. "This is ridiculous," she said, her hands gesturing frantically. "You can't just... Families don't sue each other over hurt feelings. This is about a funeral, not some business deal. There has to be some understanding, some allowance for the emotional difficulty of planning a service under these circumstances." Mr. Harrison looked up from his notes, his expression grave. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, using Jessica's married name with formal precision. "This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about the violation of specific legal provisions that were included in your father's will for exactly this type of situation. The language is clear and unambiguous. Deliberate exclusion of Sarah from major family events results in immediate forfeiture of inheritance rights." He turned to a specific page in the will and read aloud. "Should any beneficiary named in this document engage in deliberate acts of exclusion, discrimination, or systematic marginalization of Sarah Mitchell, including, but not limited to exclusion, from weddings, funerals, significant family celebrations, or other major family events, without documented justification deemed reasonable by the executor, said beneficiary's inheritance rights shall be immediately and irrevocably forfeited, with their portion of the estate reverting in full to Sarah Mitchell." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jessica was staring at the document as if she could will it to say something different, while Robert looked like he might be sick. The full scope of what they'd done was finally becoming clear to them. This wasn't just about being excluded from a funeral. This was about losing a $3 million inheritance because they couldn't bring themselves to treat me like an equal member of the family. "But Dad couldn't have known," Jessica whispered, though even as she said it, I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand otherwise. "He couldn't have predicted that we would make this kind of decision about his funeral. This feels like entrapment, like we were set up to fail." I spoke for the first time in several minutes, my voice calm but firm. "Actually, Jessica, he did predict it. When we were drafting this clause, Grandpa Joe told me, and I quote, 'Jessica will try to exclude you from my funeral because she can't stand the thought of sharing the spotlight, even in grief. She'll convince herself it's for the good of the family, but it will really be about her need to control the narrative.' I thought he was being too harsh, but he insisted on including this provision anyway." The accuracy of Grandpa Joe's prediction seemed to hit Jessica like a physical blow. She'd been so predictable in her cruelty that he'd been able to anticipate her actions and plan legal consequences accordingly. What she'd thought was her being protective of the family's dignity was actually her following a pattern of behavior that had been observed and documented for years. "He was testing us," Robert said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He set up this will to test whether we would treat Sarah fairly, and we failed." The realization seemed to age him 10 years in as many seconds. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to keep peace in the family by going along with Jessica's decisions, and now that passivity was going to cost him everything. Mr. Harrison nodded gravely. Your father was very clear about his intentions when we drafted this document. He'd observed years of what he considered systematic mistreatment of Sarah, and he wanted to ensure that such behavior would have consequences. This wasn't a test, so much as it was a natural consequence clause. If you treated Sarah with respect and inclusion, you would inherit as planned. If you continued patterns of exclusion and marginalization, you would forfeit your inheritance rights. I could see Jessica's mind racing, trying to find some legal loophole or technicality that might save her inheritance. But this is about a funeral, she said desperately. People make difficult decisions about funerals all the time. Families limit guest lists for practical reasons, for financial reasons, for all sorts of legitimate concerns. You can't lose an inheritance because you made hard choices about a funeral. You can, if those choices involve deliberate exclusion of a family member who should have been included, Mr. Harrison replied firmly. And the evidence that Sarah has provided demonstrates that this wasn't about practical concerns or financial limitations. This was about a calculated decision to exclude her specifically because you didn't want her there. That's exactly the type of behavior the forfeiture clause was designed to address. He pulled out another document and placed it on the table. Furthermore, Sarah has provided evidence that this pattern of exclusion extends beyond just the funeral. She has documentation of being systematically excluded from other family events, of having her accomplishments minimized or ignored, and of being treated as a second-class family member for years. The funeral exclusion was simply the final act that triggered the legal consequences your father had put in place. Jessica was now openly crying, though whether from grief, anger, or fear was impossible to tell. This will destroy our family, she said through her tears. How are we supposed to come back from something like this? How are we supposed to be a family when there's this kind of legal action hanging over our heads? I looked at her with something that might have been pity if I'd had any emotional energy left to spare. Jessica, the family was already destroyed, I said quietly. It was destroyed years ago when you decided I wasn't worth including, when you made excluding me a regular part of your decision-making process. This legal action isn't destroying the family, it's just making the destruction visible in a way you can't ignore anymore. The truth of my words seemed to penetrate the room like a cold wind. Robert was nodding slowly, as if finally understanding something he'd been blind to for years. Even Jessica seemed to recognize the accuracy of what I'd said, though she was clearly struggling to accept the implications. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and returned to his legal documentation. There's another matter we need to discuss, he said, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. The family business that Robert has been managing for the past several years. Sarah, would you like to explain the situation, or would you prefer that I handle this part of the revelation? I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as I reached for another folder in my briefcase. This was the part that would truly demonstrate the scope of what my family had been doing to me, the extent to which they'd been profiting from my resources while simultaneously excluding me from their lives. I'll handle it, I said, opening the folder to reveal financial documents that I'd been collecting for months. The business that Uncle Robert has been managing, I began, placing documents on the table with deliberate precision, was initially capitalized with funds from a trust that Grandpa Joe established for me when I was born. The original investment was $200,000 from my trust fund, money that was supposed to be used for my benefit and eventual inheritance. Robert's face went from pale to red to pale again as he processed what I was saying. We were managing the business for the family. It was a family investment, not a personal trust fund. But his voice lacked conviction, and I could see him beginning to understand the legal implications of what he'd been doing. Actually, I continued, consulting the documents in front of me, the original incorporation papers list me as the primary beneficiary of the trust that funded the business. The business was supposed to be held in trust for my benefit, with profits either reinvested or distributed to me as the beneficiary. Instead, you and Jessica have been paying yourselves executive salaries while telling everyone that I was financially irresponsible and needed family support. I placed a stack of financial statements on the table, each one showing profits that should have been mine being diverted to pay salaries to people who were supposed to be managing the business on my behalf. Over the past 5 years, this business has generated over $1 million in profit. Profit that legally belonged to me as the trust beneficiary, but which was instead used to fund lifestyles and purchases for people who were simultaneously telling others that I was the family financial burden. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica was staring at the financial statements as if they were written in a foreign language, while Robert looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. They were both beginning to understand that their exclusion of me hadn't just triggered the forfeiture of their inheritance. It had also exposed years of financial mismanagement that bordered on embezzlement. "There's more," I said, though at this point I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. "I have documentation showing that this business was used as collateral for personal loans that Jessica and Robert took out for their own purposes. Loans that were secured against assets that legally belonged to my trust fund. In essence, they've been using my money to guarantee their personal financial ventures while excluding me from the benefits of the business success." Mr. Harrison was taking detailed notes, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Sarah, do you have documentation of these financial irregularities? Evidence that would support claims of mismanagement or misappropriation of trust assets?" I nodded and withdrew another thick folder from my briefcase. "I have 5 years of financial statements, tax returns, loan documents, and correspondence between family members discussing the business. I also have emails where Jessica and Robert discuss using business assets for personal expenses while expressing concern about what they call my financial instability." As I spread the documents across the table, I could see the full scope of their deception becoming clear to everyone in the room. They hadn't just excluded me from family events. They'd been systematically profiting from assets that legally belonged to me, while painting me as someone who couldn't be trusted with financial responsibility. The irony was staggering, and the legal implications were severe. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We didn't know," she said desperately. "We thought we were managing family assets, not personal trust funds. We thought we were helping to build something for the whole family." But even as she spoke, I could see her own doubt creeping in. She was beginning to remember conversations, decisions, and documents that suggested she'd known exactly what she was doing. "Actually," I said, pulling out one final document, "I have an email from you to Robert from 3 years ago where you explicitly discuss the fact that the business belongs to my trust fund, but that you're going to continue managing it because you don't think I'm mature enough to handle the responsibility. In that same email, you mentioned that keeping me out of family financial discussions is important because I might ask uncomfortable questions about how the profits are being distributed." The email was damning, not just because it proved they knew they were misappropriating trust assets, but because it revealed the calculated nature of my exclusion from family financial matters. They'd been deliberately keeping me uninformed about assets that belonged to me, because they knew that if I understood the situation, I would demand accountability. Robert finally spoke, his voice hoarse with defeat. "What happens now?" he asked, though he seemed to already know the answer wasn't going to be pleasant. "What are the legal consequences of all this?" Mr. Harrison looked at me, clearly waiting for my direction on how to proceed. This was the moment I'd been building toward. For months, the culmination of all the evidence gathering and legal preparation, I had the power to destroy their financial futures completely, to pursue criminal charges for embezzlement, to ensure that they faced the full consequences of their actions. But as I looked at them sitting there, defeated and frightened, I realized That complete destruction wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was justice, acknowledgement, and the assurance that they could never treat me or anyone else this way again. I wanted them to understand the full scope of what they'd done, but I also wanted to be the kind of person who could show mercy even when justice was on my side. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The forfeiture clause has been triggered, so your inheritance rights are revoked. The $3 million estate that you were expecting to inherit will now come to me. The business assets that were funded by my trust will be transferred back to my control, and you'll both need to account for every penny of profit that should have been distributed to me over the past 5 years." I paused, letting the financial implications sink in before continuing. "However, I'm not going to pursue criminal charges for the misappropriation of trust assets, and I'm not going to demand immediate repayment of all the profits you've taken. Instead, we're going to restructure everything properly. You'll both step down from your management positions. The business will be run according to proper fiduciary standards, and any future profits will be distributed according to legal requirements, rather than family politics." The relief on their faces was palpable, though it was mixed with the bitter understanding that their positions of power and control were over forever. They would avoid criminal prosecution, but they would also never again be in a position to exclude me or anyone else from family financial matters. "There's one more condition," I added, my voice taking on a harder edge. "You will both sign formal agreements acknowledging what you've done and committing to treating me as an equal family member going forward. No more exclusions, no more dismissive comments, no more attempts to marginalize me in family decisions. If you violate these agreements, I will pursue every legal remedy available to me, including criminal charges for the financial misconduct we've discussed today." The transformation in the room was complete. Jessica and Robert, who had walked in expecting to be the primary beneficiaries of a $3 million estate, were now facing the reality that they'd lost everything through their own actions. I, who had been excluded from my grandfather's funeral that morning, was now in control of the entire family's financial future. But more importantly than the money or the power, I finally had something I'd been seeking my entire adult life: acknowledgement. They could no longer pretend I didn't matter, couldn't dismiss my accomplishments, couldn't exclude me from important decisions. The legal documents scattered across the conference table were proof that their behavior had consequences, and that those consequences could be severe. As Mr. Harrison began preparing the paperwork that would formalize the transfer of assets and the forfeiture of inheritance rights, I felt a strange sense of closure. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to end, but it was how they needed to end. Sometimes justice looks like punishment, and sometimes it looks like the quiet satisfaction of knowing that people can no longer hurt you because they no longer have the power to do so. The reckoning was complete, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding all the cards. The paperwork took 3 hours to complete. 3 hours of Mr. Harrison methodically documenting every aspect of the asset transfer, every detail of the forfeiture clause activation, every provision of the new agreements that Jessica and Robert would be required to sign. I sat in that conference room, watching my aunt and uncle transform from entitled heirs to chastened supplicants, and felt something I'd never experienced before: the profound satisfaction of watching justice unfold in real time. Jessica signed her name with shaking hands, her designer pen scratching across legal documents that stripped away not just her inheritance, but her illusion of moral superiority. Each signature was an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement that her years of exclusion and condescension had finally caught up with her. Robert signed with the resigned acceptance of a man who understood that his passivity had been as damaging as Jessica's active cruelty. When the last document was signed and notarized, Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair and regarded all of us with the satisfaction of an attorney who had just executed a perfect legal strategy. "The estate transfer will be completed within 30 days, he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Sarah, you'll have full access to all accounts and properties as of next week. The business assets will be transferred according to the timeline we discussed. As we prepared to leave, Jessica made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her expectations. "Sarah," she said, her voice small and pleading in a way I'd never heard before. "We're still family. This doesn't have to change. Everything between us. We can work through this, find a way to move forward together." The desperation in her voice was palpable. The sudden recognition that burning bridges with the person who now controlled the family's financial future might not have been the wisest strategy. I looked at her for a long moment, considering my response carefully. Part of me wanted to offer some kind of reconciliation, some path back to the fractured family relationship we'd maintained for so many years. But a larger part of me recognized that any reconciliation built on the foundation of their financial dependency would be hollow and temporary. They needed to understand that their treatment of me had consequences that extended far beyond money. "Jessica," I said finally, my voice neither cruel nor kind, simply honest. "We haven't been family for years. We've been strangers who shared holiday meals and pretended to care about each other's lives. What happened today didn't change our relationship. It just made the truth of our relationship impossible to ignore." I stood up and gathered my documents, feeling lighter than I had in years. "If you want to be family in the future, you'll need to learn how to treat me like family. But that's going to be your work to do, not mine." The drive home through Portland's afternoon traffic gave me time to process what had just occurred. In the span of a single morning, I had gone from being the excluded black sheep to being the primary heir of a $3 million estate. More importantly, I had gone from being powerless in the face of my family's systematic cruelty to holding all the power in our relationship dynamic. But as I navigated the familiar streets toward my apartment, I realized that the most significant change wasn't in my bank account or my legal standing. It was in my understanding of my own worth. For years, I had internalized my family's assessment of me, had believed on some level that their exclusion and dismissal reflected something inherently deficient in my character. Today had proven definitively that the deficiency was in their judgment, not in my worth. My phone buzzed with a text message as I pulled into my parking garage. It was from my cousin Amy, the one who had accidentally sent me the funeral photo that morning. "Sarah, I just heard what happened at the lawyer's office. I'm so sorry about everything. I never realized how badly they were treating you. Can we talk?" The message was followed by several more from other family members who had apparently learned about the day's events through the family gossip network that operated faster than any news service. I read through the messages without responding to any of them. Suddenly, family members who had been content to watch my marginalization from the sidelines were eager to express their support and concern. The timing of their outreach wasn't lost on me. Their sudden interest in my well-being coincided perfectly with their discovery that I now controlled significant family assets. It was a pattern I recognized from years of observing family dynamics, and it only reinforced my decision to maintain strict boundaries moving forward. Back in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the chair by the window where I'd received Amy's photo that morning. The same view looked different now, somehow brighter and more full of possibility. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd been thinking about for months. I deleted the family group chat that had been a source of so much pain and exclusion over the years. With that single action, I removed myself from the constant stream of family updates and inside jokes that I was never truly included in anyway. The silence that followed felt like freedom. Over the next few weeks, the practical aspects of my inheritance began to take shape. The house where Grandpa Joe had lived, the same house where I'd spent countless weekends as a child, became legally mine. Walking through those familiar rooms as their owner, rather than a visitor, was surreal and deeply emotional. I found myself touching furniture and walls that held decades of memories, understanding for the first time that these weren't just objects from my past, but resources for my future. The business transition proved more complex than I'd anticipated. Robert had been managing the operations for 5 years, and while he'd been misappropriating profits, he'd also been handling day-to-day management competently. I spent several weeks working with business consultants to understand the full scope of the operation and to identify qualified managers who could run things according to proper legal and ethical standards. What surprised me was how much I enjoyed the process. Estate planning law had taught me to think systematically about assets and inheritance, but actually managing inherited assets was giving me insights into business operations that I'd never had before. I found myself considering expanding the business, exploring new opportunities, thinking like an entrepreneur rather than just an attorney. The financial aspect of the inheritance was staggering in ways I hadn't fully comprehended during the emotional intensity of the lawyer's office confrontation. $3 million, properly invested and managed, would generate enough income to free me from many of the financial constraints that had shaped my career choices. I could take on pro bono cases that mattered to me without worrying about billable hours. I could start the nonprofit legal clinic I'd been dreaming about for years. I could make choices based on impact and passion rather than just financial necessity. But perhaps more significant than the money was the psychological shift that came with no longer being financially vulnerable to my family's approval or disapproval. For years, I'd maintained relationships that were harmful to me, partly because I feared being completely cut off from family support in times of crisis. Now, with substantial assets of my own, I could afford to have boundaries. I could afford to walk away from relationships that diminished me without fear of finding myself isolated and struggling. The family's reaction to their changed circumstances evolved over the weeks following the will reading. Jessica went through what appeared to be the 5 stages of grief in relation to her lost inheritance. Anger came first, with voicemails that started reasonable and became increasingly hostile as she worked through her fury at being cheated out of what she considered rightfully hers. Then came bargaining, with elaborate proposals for how we might share the inheritance more equitably, followed by depression when she realized that no amount of negotiation was going to restore her expected financial windfall. Robert's response was quieter, but more genuinely remorseful. He reached out several times, not to contest the inheritance terms, but to apologize for his role in my years of exclusion. His messages had a quality of genuine self-reflection that Jessica's lacked, an acknowledgement that he'd been wrong not just about the financial management, but about his treatment of me as a person. I appreciated his attempts at reconciliation, though I wasn't ready to trust that his remorse would translate into permanently changed behavior. The extended family's reaction was perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire situation. Cousins, who had been content to watch my marginalization, suddenly became vocal about the unfairness of the inheritance distribution. Aunts and uncles who had never challenged Jessica's treatment of me suddenly had opinions about family loyalty and the importance of forgiveness. The sudden concern for my emotional well-being from people who had been silent during years of systematic exclusion was both transparent and exhausting. I realized that many of them had tolerated or enabled Jessica's behavior because they'd assumed it didn't really matter in the long run. They'd thought that family relationships were just emotional dynamics that didn't have real-world consequences. The discovery that Grandpa Joe had built financial consequences into his estate plan had forced them to confront the reality that emotional cruelty could have tangible costs. 3 months after the will reading, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to host a family gathering at Grandpa Joe's house, now my house, for what would have been his 85th birthday. I sent invitations to everyone, including Jessica and Robert, with a simple message. Let's celebrate Grandpa Joe's life and talk about what family means going forward. The responses were mixed. Some family members were eager to attend, clearly, hoping to repair relationships with the person who now controlled significant family assets. Others were hesitant, uncertain about how to navigate the new family dynamics. Jessica and Robert both accepted the invitation, though their responses were cautious and formal in a way that previous family communications had never been. The day of the gathering was warm and sunny, perfect for using Grandpa Joe's backyard garden that he'd tended so carefully over the decades. I spent the morning preparing food and setting up tables, feeling simultaneously nervous and determined. This wasn't about reconciliation exactly, but it was about establishing new terms for family relationships going forward. People arrived in small groups throughout the afternoon, and I watched the careful way they interacted with me. There was a deference in their behavior that had never existed before, a recognition that I was no longer the family member who could be safely ignored or dismissed. Some of this new respect was clearly motivated by financial considerations, but some of it seemed to reflect genuine reconsideration of who I was and what I'd accomplished. Jessica arrived last, which was typical for her, but also probably strategic. She looked older than she had 3 months earlier, as if the stress of losing her expected inheritance had aged her visibly. She approached me with the kind of careful politeness that suggested she'd thought extensively about what she wanted to say. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying none of its usual commanding tone, "thank you for including us today. I know things have been complicated since Dad's funeral." The understatement was almost funny, but I could see that she was genuinely trying to find a way forward that didn't require her to admit the full scope of her past behavior. "Jessica," I replied, keeping my own tone neutral but not hostile. "I'm glad you came. Grandpa Joe would have wanted his birthday to bring family together, not drive us further apart." I meant what I said, though I also knew that any coming together would need to happen on very different terms than it had in the past. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself observing family dynamics with new eyes. Without the financial desperation that had previously motivated much of the family politics, people seemed more relaxed, more genuine in their interactions. Children played in the garden while adults shared memories of Grandpa Joe and talked about their current lives, without the undercurrent of competition and judgment that had characterized previous gatherings. At one point, Robert approached me while I was refilling drink pitchers in the kitchen. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few months, and I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement that I was wrong about who you are and what you deserved from this family." He paused, clearly struggling with emotions he wasn't used to expressing. "I let Jessica make decisions that hurt you because it was easier than standing up to her, and I'm ashamed of that cowardice." His words hit me unexpectedly hard, partly because they were the first acknowledgement I'd ever received from a family member that my treatment had been unfair. "Robert," I said, feeling my own emotions rising, "I appreciate you saying that. It means more than you probably realize." I set down the pitcher I'd been holding and looked at him directly. "I don't need anyone to make up for the past, but I do need to know that the future is going to be different." As the day wound down and family members began to leave, I found myself feeling cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding family relationships on healthier foundations. Not everyone would be able to make the transition from the old dynamics to new ones, but some seemed genuinely committed to trying. Jessica lingered after most others had left, helping me clear dishes, in a way that was completely out of character for her previous behavior at family gatherings. As we worked in companionable silence, I realized that losing her expected inheritance had forced her to confront aspects of herself that she'd never had to examine before. "Sarah," she said as we finished loading the dishwasher, "I know I can't undo the years of the way I treated you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to understand how I became someone who could act the way I did." She paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. Losing Dad's inheritance wasn't just about the money. It was about losing the identity I'd built around being the responsible daughter, the one who deserved to inherit his legacy. I looked at her with something that might have been compassion. "Jessica, you didn't lose Grandpa Joe's legacy. You just lost the financial portion of it. His real legacy was about treating people with dignity and ensuring that family meant inclusion rather than exclusion. That legacy is still available to you if you want to claim it. 6 months later, I was sitting in the office of my new legal aid clinic, reviewing case files for families dealing with estate disputes similar to what I'd experienced. The clinic was funded entirely by income from my inheritance, and it had quickly developed a reputation for helping people navigate family legal conflicts with both competence and compassion. The work was more fulfilling than anything I'd done previously in my legal career. Every case taught me something new about family dynamics, about the intersection of money and relationships, about the ways that legal structures could either perpetuate harm or create accountability. I was using my expertise to help people who couldn't afford high-end legal representation, and I was using my personal experience to understand the emotional complexities that traditional legal approaches often missed. My family relationships had evolved into something I could never have predicted. Jessica and I had developed a cordial but boundaried relationship that acknowledged our shared history without pretending that past hurts had been erased. Robert had become something approaching a genuine ally, someone who actively worked to include me in family decisions and who called out exclusionary behavior when he witnessed it from others. Most surprisingly, my extended family had gradually adjusted to the new dynamics in ways that felt more authentic than our previous interactions. Without the financial hierarchies that had previously shaped family politics, people seemed freer to relate to each other as individuals rather than as competing interests in an inheritance drama. I still lived in my apartment in Portland, but I spent weekends at Grandpa Joe's house, tending the garden he'd loved and hosting small gatherings that brought family together without the toxic dynamics that had characterized previous events. The house had become a place where family members could connect across generational lines, where children could play safely while adults had meaningful conversations about their lives and relationships. On quiet evenings in that house, sitting in the room where Grandpa Joe had told me about his will changes, I sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought me to this place. The exclusion from his funeral had been devastating, but it had also been the catalyst for changes that had transformed not just my life, but the entire trajectory of my family's relationships. I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in response to being excluded isn't to fight for inclusion in spaces that don't value you. Sometimes the most powerful response is to build your own spaces. Spaces where you set the terms for how people treat each other and where exclusion isn't tolerated from anyone. The $3 million inheritance had given me financial security, but the real gift had been the lesson that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's recognition of it. Grandpa Joe had seen my value when I couldn't see it myself, and he'd always structured his legacy in a way that would force others to see it too. But ultimately, the most important recognition had come from within myself. I'd built a life that mattered, relationships that nourished me, and work that contributed to something larger than my own success. The family that had once excluded me now treated me with respect, not because I'd fought for that respect, but because I'd demonstrated that I didn't need their approval to thrive. The girl who had been systematically marginalized and excluded had grown into a woman who created inclusion for others. The family member who had been treated as disposable had become the person who brought family together on healthy terms. The person who had been judged as unsuccessful had built something that created success for others who faced similar challenges. Sometimes justice looks like dramatic confrontations and immediate consequences. But sometimes justice looks like the quiet satisfaction of knowing that people who once had the power to hurt you no longer have that power, and that you've used your own power to ensure that others won't face the same hurts you experienced. As I locked up the legal clinic that evening and drove home through the Portland streets I'd navigated on the morning of Grandpa Joe's funeral, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because the story was over, but because the story had finally become mine to write. 2 years had passed since that transformative morning when I'd driven to Mr. Harrison's office carrying evidence of my family's betrayal. 2 years since, I'd activated the clause that stripped Jessica and Robert of their inheritance and fundamentally altered the power dynamics that had governed our family for decades. As I stood in the conference room of Mitchell Legal Aid Services, looking out at the Portland skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, I marveled at how completely my life had transformed. The legal clinic had grown beyond my wildest expectations. What had started as a small practice focused on estate disputes had evolved into a comprehensive family law center that handled everything from inheritance conflicts to custody battles to elder abuse cases. We now employed 12 attorneys, 6 paralegals, and a support staff that could rival any major law firm in the city. But unlike those firms, we measured success not just in billable hours and profit margins, but in families reunited, justice served, and vulnerable people protected from exploitation. Our most recent case had been particularly satisfying. An elderly woman named Dorothy Chen had come to us after discovering that her daughter and son-in-law had been systematically draining her bank accounts while isolating her from her other children. The parallels to my own experience were unmistakable, though Dorothy's situation involved outright financial abuse rather than the more subtle manipulation I'd endured. Working with her to recover her assets and restore her relationships with her other children had felt like completing a circle that began in Mr. Harrison's office 2 years earlier. The success of the clinic had attracted attention from legal journals and social service organizations across the Pacific Northwest. Just last month, I'd been invited to speak at the Oregon State Bar Association's annual conference about using inherited wealth for social impact. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being celebrated for work that had only been possible because of my family's systematic exclusion and the legal provisions Grandpa Joe had crafted in response to their behavior. But the professional success, gratifying as it was, paled in comparison to the personal transformation I'd experienced. The woman who had once internalized her family's assessment of her worth had developed an unshakable sense of her own value. The daughter who had begged for inclusion in family events now created spaces where inclusion was the fundamental operating principle. The attorney who had once focused primarily on billable hours now spent her days ensuring that legal representation was available to people regardless of their ability to pay. My relationship with money had evolved as well. The $3 million inheritance that had seemed so significant during those initial months had become simply a tool for creating the kind of impact I wanted to have in the world. I lived comfortably, but not extravagantly, invested conservatively, but strategically, and gave generously to causes that aligned with my values. Financial security had given me the freedom to make choices based on meaning rather than necessity, and that freedom had revealed aspects of my character that had been suppressed by years of financial anxiety. The family business that Robert had mismanaged for so many years had also flourished under proper oversight. I'd hired professional managers and implemented transparent accounting practices that ensured all profits were distributed according to legal requirements rather than family politics. The business now employed over 50 people and had expanded into 3 neighboring states. More importantly, it operated according to principles of fairness and respect that would have made Grandpa Joe proud. Some of the profits from the business supported the legal clinic, but I'd also established scholarship funds for law students from underrepresented backgrounds and grants for other legal aid organizations doing similar work in communities that couldn't support their own clinics. The ripple effects of Grandpa Joe's will extended far beyond our family, touching the lives of hundreds of people who would never know that their access to legal representation had been made possible by an old man's determination to hold his family accountable for their treatment of one marginalized member. My personal relationships had undergone equally dramatic changes. The family gathering I'd hosted on Grandpa Joe's birthday had become an annual tradition, but it bore little resemblance to the gatherings of my childhood. These events were characterized by genuine affection and mutual respect, rather than the toxic dynamics of competition and exclusion that had previously defined family interactions. Children played freely while adults engaged in conversations that were both deeper and more relaxed than anything I remembered from previous family events. Jessica's transformation had been perhaps the most surprising aspect of the past 2 years. The loss of her expected inheritance had forced her to confront aspects of her character that she'd never had to examine before. Initially, this self-examination had been painful and defensive, but gradually it had evolved into something approaching genuine personal growth. She'd started therapy, something she'd previously dismissed as unnecessary, and had begun to understand the psychological patterns that had driven her need to control and exclude others. Our relationship now could best be described as cautiously positive. We weren't close in the way that some sisters are, but we had developed a mutual respect that was based on honest acknowledgement of our past and realistic expectations for our future. Jessica had learned to see me as an equal rather than a threat, and I had learned to interact with her without the defensive postures that had characterized our previous encounters. She'd also taken steps to repair relationships with other family members she'd alienated over the years. The recognition that her behavior had cost her millions of dollars had apparently motivated a broader examination of how that same behavior had damaged other important relationships. While not everyone was willing to forgive or forget, many family members had been remarkably generous in their willingness to give her opportunities to demonstrate changed behavior. Robert's journey had been different, but equally significant. His natural inclination toward passivity had been challenged by the realization that silence in the face of harmful behavior was itself a form of harm. He'd become an active advocate for inclusion and fairness in family decisions, often going out of his way to ensure that marginalized voices were heard and respected. His transformation from passive enabler to active ally had been one of the most heartening developments of the past 2 years. The extended family had also adjusted to the new dynamics in ways that continued to surprise me. Without the financial hierarchies that had previously shaped family politics, people seemed more authentic in their interactions with each other. Conversations were more genuine, conflicts were addressed more directly, and celebrations felt more like actual celebrations rather than performances of family harmony. My cousin Amy, who had accidentally sent me the funeral photo that started this entire sequence of events, had become something approaching a true friend. She'd reached out several times over the past 2 years, not seeking financial favors but genuinely interested in rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. Her children had started spending occasional weekends at Grandpa Joe's house, playing in the same garden where I'd found solace as a child after my parents died. Even more meaningful was the relationship I'd developed with some of the younger family members who had grown up witnessing the toxic dynamics but hadn't understood what they were seeing at the time. Several of my younger cousins had reached out as they'd entered adulthood, expressing gratitude for the way I'd changed family interactions and created spaces where everyone could feel valued and included. The house that had been Grandpa Joe's, and was now mine, had become a gathering place that embodied the values he'd tried to instill in all of us. The rooms that had once felt heavy with unspoken tensions now rang with laughter and genuine conversation. The garden that he'd tended so carefully continued to flourish under my care, and had been expanded to include areas where children could play safely while adults relaxed in comfortable seating areas. I'd made some changes to the house to better accommodate large gatherings and to reflect my own style, but I'd been careful to preserve the elements that held the most meaning from my childhood. Grandpa Joe's study remained exactly as he'd left it, with his books and papers still arranged. On the desk where we'd worked together on homework assignments and later on the legal documents that would reshape our family's future. The professional recognition that had come with the clinic's success had opened doors to opportunities I'd never imagined when I was struggling to build my initial law practice. I'd been appointed to several state committees focused on legal, aid, and access to justice issues, and I'd testified before legislative committees about the importance of funding legal services for low-income families. The expertise I'd developed through my own family's legal struggles had given me insights that proved valuable in policy discussions about inheritance law and elder abuse prevention. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from the clients whose lives had been changed by the work of the clinic. Letters and emails arrived regularly from people whose families had been preserved, whose inheritances had been protected, whose voices had been heard in legal proceedings that might otherwise have silenced them. Each story reminded me that the pain I'd experienced at the hands of my own family had been transformed into something that could prevent or address similar pain for others. The speaking engagements and professional accolades were gratifying, but the real measure of success was visible in the daily operations of the clinic. Young attorneys who might have spent their careers focused solely on maximizing their own income were instead learning to use their skills in service of justice and community welfare. Paralegals and support staff were developing expertise in areas like family mediation and elder advocacy that would serve them and their future clients throughout their careers. We'd also begun offering training programs for other legal aid organizations, sharing the systems and approaches we'd developed through our work with family disputes and inheritance conflicts. The model we'd created was being replicated in other communities, extending the impact of Grandpa Joe's will far beyond what he could have imagined when he first decided to hold his family accountable for their treatment of me. The financial aspects of my inheritance had stabilized into a comfortable routine of conservative management and strategic philanthropy. The original $3 million had grown through careful investment and prudent business management, but I'd also given away substantial amounts to causes that reflected the values Grandpa Joe and I had shared. Education scholarships, legal aid funding, and programs that supported family reconciliation and healing had all benefited from the fortune that had come to me through such painful circumstances. I'd also established a foundation that would continue. This work long after I was gone, with governance structures designed to prevent the kind of family conflicts that had necessitated Grandpa Joe's will provisions in the first place. The Foundation's board included family members who had demonstrated genuine commitment to the values of inclusion and justice, but it also included independent members who could ensure continuity of mission regardless of family dynamics. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on a conversation I'd had earlier in the day with a new client whose situation bore striking similarities to my own family's history. Maria Santos had come to the clinic after discovering that her siblings had been systematically excluding her from decisions about their aging mother's care, while simultaneously using her mother's assets to fund their own lifestyles. The patterns of exclusion, financial manipulation, and family gaslighting were depressingly familiar. But what struck me most about Maria's story wasn't the similarities to my own experience, but the differences in her resources for addressing the situation. She had access to legal representation through the clinic. She had advocates who understood the psychological as well as legal aspects of family abuse, and she had a support system that could help her navigate the complex process of holding her family accountable while protecting her own emotional well-being. 2 years ago, I would have been able to help Maria only as an attorney providing technical legal services. Now, I could offer her a comprehensive approach that addressed not just the legal violations she'd suffered, but the emotional healing. She would need to rebuild her sense of self-worth and her relationships with family members who were willing to change their behavior. Working with clients like Maria had taught me that my own experience, as painful as it had been, was far from unique. Families across the country were struggling with dynamics of exclusion, financial abuse, and systematic marginalization that destroyed relationships and impoverished both the excluded members and the family units as a whole. The legal system was often ill-equipped to address these problems because they existed at the intersection of law, psychology, and family dynamics in ways that traditional legal approaches couldn't adequately handle. The clinic's success had demonstrated that there was enormous unmet need for legal services that understood these complexities and could address them holistically. We'd developed approaches that combined traditional legal advocacy with mediation, counseling, and family systems intervention in ways that often preserved and strengthened family relationships even while holding harmful behavior accountable. This work had also given me a broader perspective on my own family's transformation. The changes in Jessica, Robert, and our extended family weren't just the result of financial consequences for their behavior, though those consequences had certainly provided motivation for change. The real transformation had come through the hard work of examining harmful patterns, taking responsibility for past actions, and learning new ways of relating to each other based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. As I drove home through the Portland evening, I found myself thinking about a letter I'd received the previous week from a law student at Lewis & Clark who had heard about the clinic's work and wanted to apply for a summer internship. Her personal statement had described growing up in a family where her academic achievements were consistently minimized because they threatened her brother's sense of their own importance. She'd written about feeling invisible at family gatherings, excluded from important conversations, and dismissed when she tried to contribute to family decisions. Reading her letter had transported me back to my own experiences of feeling erased and marginalized, but it had also filled me with hope. This young woman was seeking out opportunities to use her legal education in service of others facing similar challenges, and she was doing so from a position of strength rather than victimhood. She understood that her painful experiences could become the foundation for meaningful work that would prevent others from suffering in the same ways. I'd already decided to offer her the internship, and I was looking forward to mentoring someone whose journey toward legal advocacy had begun with personal experiences of family exclusion and systematic devaluation. The cycle that had begun with my own marginalization and Grandpa Joe's response to it was continuing through the lives and careers of people who had never met either of us, but were benefiting from the ripple effects of his decision to build consequences into his will. That evening, I sat in Grandpa Joe's study, now my study, reviewing files from the day's cases and preparing for the next day's client meetings. The room felt peaceful in a way that would have been impossible during the years when I was fighting for basic recognition of my worth within my own family. The struggle for belonging had been replaced by the satisfaction of creating belonging for others. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. "Thank you for including everyone in the holiday planning discussion today. I know I haven't always been easy to work with, but I appreciate your patience as I learn to be a better sister and family member." The message was followed by a photo she'd taken during our earlier video call, showing her 2 children working on thank you cards for the scholarship recipients we'd selected together from the foundation's applicant pool. The transformation in our relationship hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been easy for either of us. But it had been genuine, and it had created space for connections that neither of us had thought possible during the years when our interactions were characterized by competition and resentment. Jessica's children now knew me as the aunt who supported their education and encouraged their interests, rather than the family member who was grudgingly tolerated at holiday gatherings. These relationships with the next generation felt like perhaps the most important legacy of the changes that had begun with my exclusion from Grandpa Joe's funeral. Children who might have grown up witnessing and normalizing patterns of family exclusion and marginalization were instead learning about inclusion, respect, and the importance of using privilege and resources to lift up others rather than maintaining hierarchies of power and control. As I prepared for bed that night, I walked through the house that had become both my home and a symbol of how dramatically life could change when people were finally held accountable for their actions. The rooms that had once felt heavy with unspoken tensions now felt light and welcoming. The spaces that had witnessed years of subtle and not-so-subtle cruelty had been transformed into places where love and respect were the governing principles. I paused in the hallway outside what had been my childhood bedroom during the years I'd lived with Grandpa Joe after my parents died. The room now served as a guest room for family members visiting from out of town, but I'd preserved some of the elements that had made it feel safe and nurturing during those difficult years. The bookshelf still held some of my favorite childhood books, and the window still looked out onto the garden where I'd found solace during the hardest periods of adjusting to life without my parents. Standing in that hallway, I realized that the scared, grieving child who had once lived in that room would never have imagined that the family conflicts and exclusions she was enduring would eventually become the foundation for work that would help hundreds of other families heal their own wounds and rebuild their relationships on healthier terms. Pain that had seemed pointless and destructive at the time had been transformed into purpose and healing, not just for me, but for countless others whose lives had been touched by the work of the clinic. The journey from exclusion to empowerment hadn't been linear or easy, but it had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond my own personal growth. The legal provisions that Grandpa Joe had crafted to protect me from my family's cruelty had created ripple effects that were still expanding, touching lives, and creating opportunities for justice and healing in communities I would never visit and for people I would never meet. As I finally settled into bed that night, I thought about the young woman I'd been on the morning of Grandpa Joe's funeral, standing in my apartment bathroom reading a text message that revealed the depth of my family's deliberate exclusion. That woman had been hurt, angry, and determined to hold her family accountable for their behavior, but she'd had no idea that her quest for personal justice would evolve into a career dedicated to creating justice for others. The transformation from excluded family member to successful attorney to nationally recognized advocate for family justice had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, through daily choices to use privilege and resources in service of others, rather than just for personal benefit. Each client served, each family reunited, each inheritance protected, each vulnerable person empowered, had been both a victory in itself and a step toward the larger goal of creating a world where families were spaces of nurturing and inclusion rather than competition and exclusion. Lying in the darkness of the house that had become a symbol of transformation and healing, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. The pain of exclusion had been real and devastating, but it had also been the catalyst for changes that had made my life more meaningful than I'd ever imagined possible. The family that had once rejected me now looked to me for leadership and guidance, not because of fear or financial dependence, but because I'd demonstrated, through consistent actions, that I was committed to creating spaces where everyone could thrive. The last thing I thought about before falling asleep was tomorrow's schedule, which included meetings with 3 new clients whose families were struggling with dynamics similar to what I'd experienced, a consultation with attorneys from 2 other states who wanted to establish similar clinics in their communities, and a strategy session with the Foundation Board about expanding our scholarship program to include students interested in elder law and family mediation. Each of these activities represented another opportunity to transform personal pain into communal healing, to use the lessons learned through my own family's dysfunction to prevent or address similar dysfunction in other families. The work would continue tomorrow and for years to come, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond what Grandpa Joe could have imagined when he first decided that actions should have consequences, and that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. The excluded daughter had become the includer, the marginalized family member had become the creator of belonging, and the victim of family cruelty had become the architect of family healing. Justice had been served not through revenge or punishment, but through the patient work of building something better from the ashes of what had been broken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.